Welcome back to The Circle. Today we're joined by Soma Miller, founder of The Essential Man, to explore how unresolved wounds shape our lives and how men's work, brotherhood, and embodiment practices can help us step into maturity, integrity, and purpose. Tim, Soma, are you ready to go all in?
I'm ready.
Ready.
Let's do this then. So, Soma, I'm so glad you could join us here today. Could you share a little bit about your journey? What led you to men's work and the creation of The Essential Man? And how did your own experiences shape the work that you do today?
Mm. Yeah. So it's been quite a long journey between, the my introduction to men's work. Got into this work in my early 20s. I was living in Southern California. Was kind of inspired by this lecture presentation type of thing I went to about a man talking about rites of passage work. And yeah, I just felt this kind of something awaken in me, like kind of a hunger or a calling to understand what it means to be a man. And I don't know where even that came from, right? That whole like longing. But it spoke to me. And soon after that, it was kind of like a series of serendipitous things that led me to finding a teacher or like a mentor that was leading a group of men through a year-long rite of passage experience. His name was Francis Weller. Since leading a number of different groups such as mine through that work, he's done a lot of really powerful writing and exploration around grief. That's kind of his primary focus. But yeah, it was the work that we did. It was one of his teachers, and the kind of the lineage that he came through was a teacher by the name of Malidoma Somé, who's kind of like a indigenous elder shaman, came from Africa and brought some of those more traditional rites of passage. And so, Francis's work was like kind of an adaptation of that was a bit more designed to fit, modernity and our modern cultural conditioning. But it was very still much rooted in how can we, in a way, reclaim our relationship to nature and the sacred.
You mentioned in that wanting to understand better what it meant to be a man, and I'm curious if divinity and connection to nature are two primary components from your view of what it means to be an authentic man today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. For me, like I tend to lean away from any kind of blanket ideologies of like, this is how it should be. Because I think it's really up to each man to discover that for himself. It's been very much a part of my life. And yeah, it's certainly in my value system to advocate for of course, like the relationship to nature, which is, who we are fundamentally. But, the way that we live in our modern lives is quite disconnected. And yeah, so to me, like there is a truth in that I live as a principle and try to integrate into my work without being too moralistic about it. But yeah, I think how we treat nature, our relationship to nature, is really a key component that I think is missing from a lot of men's lives because we are, we've kind of been conditioned and indoctrinated in this kind of command and conquer and control version of masculinity that has, created a certain paradigm in our consciousness, right? And I think that shows up in how we relate on all different levels, right? So yes, and then as well as like the sacred or the divine, right? It's one of those things that, a lot of people have an experience of. It's hard to define what that is. It's more of a feeling, it's more of a possibility, more of a mystery. And again, I think those things are kind of intertwined, right? Like in some cosmologies of thought, right? Like the nature and that, mysterious, ineffable, unfathomable aspect of existence is actually more of like the feminine, right? The divine feminine. And in our kind of patriarchal worldview, we've got this kind of very like masculine ideal of God or the divine. But that's not actually really what resonates for me.
Yeah.
It's actually more the divine feminine is like, um, it's that part of us that we can't really conquer, we can't ever fully understand, and that's a good thing, right? It kind of puts us in this place of humility, which creates a kind of openness, and I think that's a very powerful way to operate.
Yeah, I resonate with that, and something that's striking me right now is your comfortability level with these themes and these topics. And so I'm curious if you could take us back to before your rite of passage, and talk to me a little bit about like your youth and how your did you have a connection to nature and the divine early on, or was it something that you discovered through this rite of passage that you went on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I'm kind of a unique being in a certain sense, in that I grew up in a household that was very like creative, artistic, progressive thinking, and so I think that certainly had an influence on me. And I would say my relationship with nature is pretty inherent into my being. It came online pretty early in my life when I just felt drawn to like gardening and just being outside and creating. And however, there were certain events in early childhood and then um, my teenage years that opened me up more. One of those being working with psychedelics as a teenager, and it just kind of turned me on to that kind of vastness, right? The awareness of the interconnectedness of things, and there was a kind of sense making that opened up in me, and a contrasting with like this awareness of like a connection to like this is how we're meant to live, and sort of contrasting that with this is kind of how we're living as a culture, and something just felt kind of off to me, and yeah, so those were kind of built into my path. And I think the initiation for me, what that brought online, I think I was already like a deep introspective, creative, kind of mystical person pretty early on as a teenager. But that rite of passage experience for me was really about finding a sense of belonging in community, of realizing that I'm not here to like process my emotions alone. That I need spaces where I can like bring my full self, particularly with men. And it was also about learning to feel safe with men, because I think even though I grew up in a household that was forward thinking and progressive, there was also with that came a certain um, projection of the story that a lot of us hear these days, like men are bad, men are the problem, right? My mom had a lot of wounding with the masculine with her father, right? And so in a way, like I'm grateful that I grew up in that environment, but I was a little bit like feminized, right? Like I wasn't. My mom was not comfortable with masculine energy, and so uh, it helped me to really develop my feminine creative side. But I think it really took being around other men uh, in a sacred container that allowed me to feel like, oh yeah, I fucking love men. Like men are amazing.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm curious about like the rite of passage, especially since we're thinking about men's work and specifically for queer men. I believe a lot of queer men that I know have had their own sort of rites of passage, like having to leave home, having to find often chosen family and new things. And so I'm curious because my experience of those are often that they're just sort of thrust upon the person. They don't exist in a safe container or with like the safety that you mentioned. So could you talk a little bit about how or why you think men can really benefit from the safety of a container and in that rite of passage, like for all men?
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think because collectively we have for millennia gone through these experiences. It's kind of like in our DNA, right? Like men used to be initiated, and so on some level, I think part of the psyche or the soul looks for that, and I think we end up in a way creating those rites of passages unconsciously and maybe like harmful or destructive ways because we're unconsciously looking for that structure to help us to really emotionally mature is really what I think the work is. It's really our work as men is like, how do we emotionally mature? How do we grow up? Um, and I think the boy in all of us, right, is looking to find, an archetype that can help us be an expression of our mature masculine. And if we don't have those kind of containers, right, where it's modeled, right, it's transmitted, it's sort of, what I found in men's spaces, like there is a consciousness that emerges when men get together that is, as a whole, more developed than like an individual man trying to like up level his life, right? Like we try to do in personal development work, right? There's like something that comes alive and online that happens when men merge together because there's just more of a field of awareness. And so I don't really think like there's a lot of people that try to self initiate, right? And I just don't think it's really effective because we need, it's like, sitting in a room of like mirrors where we can see the back of our body and like our insides and, all these parts that we can't really see alone, right? We always are going to have blind spots. And so, yeah, I think there's something that happens in that kind of container where our stuff comes to the surface, right? It gets amplified, it gets activated, the good and the bad, right? All the stuff, the shadows, even our beauty and our greatness. And it's hard to see all of it. It's hard to see even the good parts of ourselves. And I really think that uh, maybe modern initiations are a bit different than they needed to be in the past. I think men deal with so much shame and self-deprecation that um, we need safe spaces for men to come and see who they really are.
Absolutely.
Y-
The wounds from childhood really can do a number on people. And I'll speak from my own experience of, you know, like the wounds that I experienced early on caused me to grow up very quickly. and start to put on this facade, this armor that like I'm gonna be a man at the age of 6, right? And did not have the chance to fully be a boy. And it hasn't been until recently of my deeper dive into men's work and going on retreat and being with men that I've actually started to feel the safety and comfort to let that boy out a little bit more and to
Hmm.
allow, like you said, this almost hall of mirrors to reflect back at me the the wounds that I'm running from or that I'm afraid of, and also the beauty that is inside of me as well. And so just hearing you talk about that, like I resonate with this work so much because of that, right? Of being able to like start to like like let my inner boy out and like let him be held in the company of men and conscious men and on my way to becoming a conscious man myself.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love hearing that. And yeah, I think there is a lot of grief that we carry as men because of that, for different reasons, right? We cut off parts of ourselves in this way. And, my idea of emotional maturity is not about getting rid of the boy entirely. It's more about looking at the strategies that the boy used to survive, right? Or the parts of himself that he disconnected from, so that like that healthy integrated boy energy can kind of come online and bring playfulness and that kind of awe and wonder and curiosity about life. Like that's such an important vital energy. And but he needs to feel safe to bring that. Yeah.
So I entered into men's work shortly after pandemic, and I went into this coaching program. Everything had shut down. All my work was face to face, and I opted to go into a men's coaching program, men's wisdom work run by Zaparaka. Um,
Mm.
and I did it because I thought I'm afraid of straight men. I have a lifetime of proof that they are dangerous, and I felt like I needed to uh, walk into the environment to heal that. And,
Mm.
um, and in that process, and I've been in men's work since then, so clearly I see like what it's capable of doing and why I want to bring it to my community. But what I was fascinated by was, as a queer person, I had a mistrust of men, and a lot of other queer people that I knew also had that mistrust. You just spoke about like your mom and sort of a cultural sort of um, feeling around men or masculinity, but then I learned, as you just voiced, other straight men were also struggling with their ability to trust men. That was a thing that I wasn't initially super clued into, but it felt when I got there like a shared experience. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about um, the importance of healing that, like how we heal that mistrust so that we can have the experiences that we all just mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to me, that's like one of the most potent aspects of men's work that I've experienced is really where we can kind of take down our guard and as men like learn to share the those deeper vulnerable truths. And I know vulnerability is kind of a buzzword, but it's like what are the things that we're afraid to share, right? What are the things that just feel like too taboo, too out there? There's so much shame around them. If we can lean into those things, what I found is that it just creates such a resonance, and like a trust building that it draws us closer to each other, um, and we feel not alone. I think there's such a loneliness in the hearts of so many men because we feel like we're the only ones with the issue, right? We're the only ones struggling. I'm fucked up, like nobody else is.
Yeah.
um, but when you start to share, you realize, oh yeah, you got that too, right? um, and there's such a almost like a relief that happens, right? And it I found that when I witness men do that, and when I've done that myself, um, it creates just such a freedom to be beyond the circle itself, right? Beyond being in the group, like you realize that you're not so dark and twisted, or that your dark and twistedness is okay,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah.
Um, and and then, like, it's just easier to relax into life, and just to be more yourself, and then, like, the gift of that is just more of all of you comes online, just more creativity, more sense of connection and belonging. So there's just like a multi-layered um, way that it plays out. And I think it really also helps in relationships, right? Because I think there's, the scary, vulnerable parts of ourselves that we think are not okay to bring to our really close, intimate relationships too. And it creates this kind of pressure, right? When our intimate relationships are like the only place that that's allowed to come out. Um, and I think when that happens, it just, it creates these kind of distortions, where it's harder for often for a partner to like be with that, because we haven't learned how to be with ourselves. We haven't been reflected back that we're okay there, right? Like, that's okay, that part of us. And so I think the just to kind of emphasize, when we sit in a circle and we can be held by all these different beings and bodies and minds and hearts, um, the the weight of holding ourselves is not so dense and heavy, and I think it then becomes easier for like a closer, intimate relationship to be able to kind of metabolize what we bring.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's just so important. When people ask me about men's work, um, oftentimes the question is coming from the outside in. So, like, well, how does that chi generator, or how does that like journaling practice, like, how does that, relate? And I try to tell people it's really about like this breadth of experience that allows us to show up more fully in relationship, in the way we engage in our world. Like, the more I know myself, the more I know my edges, the more I know my capacities and, my vulnerabilities, and the more that I'm able to show it, the more fully I can be with you. That's a hard thing though to like put in an Instagram post, right? And so you're like, oh, well,
Right.
yeah,
It is hard. Yeah. I mean, that's always been the hard part, is like selling men on the value of it. It's because it's such an experiential thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's a
Hmm.
man in a mirror space, an embodied masculine, a man that I love, uh, and I've known him for quite a long time. And I'm just on the last retreat, we were having this conversation, and I remember walking down from the hike thinking, like, here's this man that I value deeply. We see each other like occasionally, once every 2 years, or, um, but can call him whenever I need and feel held and heard by him, and he can do the same for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, whatever Instagram post would be needed to like have that moment, because you're like, well, that's part of the gold right there. That ability to be like, I trust this dude. I can tell him it's the magic in it.
The magic of being held and supported, to know that you've got other people in the world that can relate to your experience, that it's not just your burden to carry by yourself. There's
Hmm.
been a couple moments in my life where I've been able to really let my body relax someplace, and one of them was actually in a mud bath in Napa Valley. Right? Like, I was in this, like, I didn't know what I was signing up for. I was like, "That sounds fun." So, like, me and an ex-boyfriend and his brother, we just booked this, like, spa experience where we, like, sat in mud, and then they, like, threw more mud on top of us, and the beautiful thing about a mud bath is that, like, the viscosity of it allows your body to, like, fully be suspended. And,
Mm-hmm.
like, you get to kind of, like, just let go because your body is being supported even though you're not sinking to the bottom, right? You're just kinda suspended in this beautiful earth. And
Hmm.
that feeling is similar to the feeling that I get when I'm with men who are also doing the work. I feel like I'm in this beautiful, warm, delicious mud bath with them where I'm like, I can rest my body. I don't have
Mm.
to be so on edge, and I feel like I can actually just rest, like, be supported.
Well, it feels like it might be true for all men, certainly true for queer men, this fear of abandonment. I feel like one of the things that men's work does, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is it lets me know, oh, I can have a conflict, uh, and I'm not immediately confronted with the idea of like, this is going to ruin my relationship. You're going to stop being my friend. You're never going to talk to me again. We're going to
Mm.
get into a fight. The
Tim
work.
is reading the inside ticker of my mind right now.
Well, just if you know you have the tools and a conscious man in front of you, like, oh, I can bring a hard thing to this person, and it won't necessarily mean my abandonment or like the destruction of everything that we've built. And I think specific like a lot. I think queer men have that experience, but I have to imagine straight men have that too. And then the tools allow a different kind of relaxation. You're like, oh, I can relax if I know this isn't going to crumble with a light breeze.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that need to belong is such a quintessential aspect of our human experience, and it's very much survival based. So when that feels threatened, which is kind of constant in our modern like nuclear household way of relating, right? We don't really have a tribe where we got like 20 other people that love us, right? And generally. So we invest so much into like our one other, and when that feels threatened, right, that's when all of our survival strategies tend to come online. So we end up being like less authentic. We withhold our truth. We um, do the things, right. We distract ourselves. We numb. We run away. We hide. So yeah, I think particularly when we can develop more of a kind of ecosystem of belonging, right? That just goes beyond our intimate relationships. There's just more sustainability, and I really like to look at it as an ecosystem. I mean, this is another way that I bring in the nature as a model to how we're supposed to live, right? Like rather than like having parasitic relationships, we're symbiotic with all these kind of, you know, interrelational support systems. A tree doesn't just rely on the dirt, it relies on like the microorganisms, it relies on the roots of other trees. So there's all these kind of systems in place to support us. And I really, fundamentally think that we as men have forgotten that we belong to something bigger. And it isn't just about our human to human relationships either, right? It's also about our relationship to the universe, to the sacred mystery, to the natural world. Like we can get so much support and sustenance from just being outside. Yeah.
I'm interested as you were talking. I'm thinking about this like symbiotic nature and how we kind of moved away from it, and this idea of this lone wolf, like strong guy. And I think partly that became enticing because it felt sexy or cool. And then
Mm.
the question that sort of popped up is like, well, um, how do we make this other possible expression that may be a more authentic expression of our masculinity also sexy, one that runs the gamut. I mean, is the movie just too long? Does it need like, you know what I mean? Like because I like, oh, we all want to be John Wayne or the Marlboro Man or this guy who's always strong and never needs help and kind of always wins. But what you're kind of talking about is, oh, this ability to ebb and flow where sometimes I am the strength of the trunk. Sometimes I'm relying on other trees or the fungi or whatever, So I'm curious if you have any ideas about um that.
Yeah. How to make interrelational masculinity sexy.
Yeah. That is
I
the
mean,
question.
I love it.
it's a good question, and I'm curious because I don't know how much of this. I mean, it sounds like it's not that much different from like heteronormative programming and queer based programming. I don't really know that how it impacts differently, right? Because I think there's a lot of women that say they want more of a man's vulnerability, right? But they're also like still looking for this archetype of like, the strong man that's just, the provider, whatever. Um, but I think it's a bit distorted and romanticized, right? And I think I don't know where that came online, to be honest. I don't know if it's like Hollywood or it's fantasies, but I think there's a truth in like being able to be strong and resilient. Like that's valuable. It's useful. Like we want to be able to provide as men. Um, but like I think how we do that, like it's like a tree looks solid and strong on its own, but you don't see all the invisible relationships that are supporting it. And maybe that's where the distortion comes in, is like where we only see the strong, successful guy. Especially now, it's even more distorted, right? Because we just see these like images of whoever somebody is from the outside. It's very superficial. Like we don't know the underworkings of what allowed them to get to where they are, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of it's postured and fake too, right?
You don't get the full context. You get a snapshot, right? You don't see the entire team behind somebody or all
Mhm.
the interconnections that allow somebody to look and appear successful. That person didn't make it all on their own. There's so many different things at play that allowed for that to happen. And so even think
Mhm.
about the trees. It's like it's not just even the fellow trees, it's also like rain and sun and like all these other things
Yeah.
that like have to come together to allow for that tree to grow and to be as strong and stable as it can be so it can withstand storms. It's nourishment. And so how do we make nourishment sexy?
Well, I think in part it's about allowing men to be more than one thing at one time.
Mm,
And I feel
Mhm.
like there's a lot of education now about like, well, you are like the provider and it looks like this, and not having a robust conversation around like, well, I can be um many things. So I have this one example. I used to be a professional dancer. I can at times be like very like playful and like flamboyant, and then so I had dancer friends come see me at work when I was assistant managing a gym in New York City called Crunch. And they said later, they're like, "Tim, like you seem so upset. Like, what's going on?" I'm like, "I'm not upset. I'm the manager." I was like, I like both of these things are true expressions of who I am, but I can't
Mhm.
I can't like do a high kick and like make everyone laugh when I'm the manager. I can do that in rehearsal on break.
Yeah.
Just as an example, I
but
think the more we have that, the more all men have the ability to be like, I can be nurturing, I can be sensitive or a good listener, and then I can be primal in bed and make love to whomever I'm making love to in that way. These can all coexist.
I would like to see a future though where something can coexist and that's a manager doing a high kick while still managing, right? I
Yeah.
do believe there's also that those things should also be able to exist.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I would do one right now if I were warmed up. Yeah.
Woo!
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I've always kind of admired in the queer community is it seems I mean, at least from the outside, right? It seems like there is a little bit more permission for like self-expression, in more range. I don't know, it could be different layers of conditioning there, but yeah, I think for myself, that's something I've had to learn how to um, bring online, and I think I've had to practice, leaning into these different layers of my being and allowing them to be witnessed, right, in a safe space, so that I could feel like, all right, this part of me is welcome, and this part of me is welcome, and this part of me is welcome, and I think the men that are really the sexiest and most attractive, just to bring it back to that point, are the men that have gotten to that point of like real self-acceptance, where they're not really giving a fuck that much about what other people think about them. They're just kind of unapologetically who they are.
Mm.
And it's like, all different. I mean, we see that in like the rock star archetype, right? Like where they could have like long flowing hair and big bell bottoms, whatever, and they're totally considered masculine or desirable or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Whatever masculinity is, like it's a bit of a nebulous concept on some level, right? Like we culturally form what that is to a degree, and I think there's also some natural characteristics, right? But it's all kind of coming through this lens of reductionism a little bit, right? And so as soon as we reduce something to this is how it is, it becomes it starts to get distorted, right? It doesn't really have the freedom to evolve. And so that's kind of why I lean away from even some of the modern men's work stuff where it really tries to like rigidly define like this is what it means to be a man, this is how you're supposed to show up, you know. I try to, you know, like invite in masculine qualities, how can we play with them, feel them in our body, get a sense of like, oh, maybe I'm a bit cut off from that part, but not limit ourselves to that's what it means to be a man.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm curious then, I imagine the men that you work with are drawn to you for the unique kind of medicine that you're bringing. How do you see it positively impacting them?
I think some of what I've already spoken to is like there's just a little bit more permission to be who they are, like, and that turns into like self-acceptance, right? Like, oh yeah, like this part of me is okay, like it's okay to sometimes feel like needy and dependent. And you know, I think the problem is not the neediness, you know, or whatever the thing that we think is wrong. It's the problem is that we think it's wrong, right? And so that makes it become something like an expression that can then actually become toxic, right? Because we are having this layer of shame over it, and it becomes like a shadow form of the thing that really is just a, you know, an energetic expression of being.
Mm.
But when we suppress and we judge and we reject these things that are true to who we are, true to our essence, right? Like my brand is called The Essential Man. It's really about men tapping into their true essence. And that is, you know, this unique signature of humanity that moves through you that really can't be defined and encapsulated. You know, it's just is. And you know, ultimately that's really my mission, right? Is to give men space to embody their true essence of being.
Mm.
And that's just like really living beyond conditioning and being free to be who we are. And I see that when men like really confront their shame and feel like it's okay to show up. You know, it might start just in a container, a coaching container, where it's like, hey, let's welcome that part, right? He's safe to be here. Like, what does he need? What does he want?
Mm.
Um, and that allows for men to show up more authentically, bring their hearts more, share their truth, be more honest, express their desires, all these things.
When you were
Yeah.
speaking, the image that kept popping up for me was the image of a piano, as if it like sort of represents the like the whole range of human experience, and then each person or each song, you're like, oh, I may not use every key. I get to experiment with like what is available, and then I can find like the range where I'm most comfortable. But like even the recognition of like, oh, I can resonate this note and this note and this note and this note, feels like a really powerful possibility. And then it feels like men's workspaces are creating that space into which we can start to explore
Hmm.
what parts of us exist and maybe how much of it we want, right? Like,
Hmm.
yeah, just maybe I want a pinch of this and 2 cups of that. And that's my recipe, right?
All notes are welcome, and if your piano's a little out of tune, don't worry, we got you. We will help tune it up a little bit so that you can continue to play all of those beautiful notes and find the melody that is the truest expression of you.
Hmm.
So, beautiful analogy.
Boom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love what you're saying, Soma, about like this the language that I keep hearing you saying is warm and inviting and welcoming. And I think that like the more that we feel invited, the more that we feel welcome, the more it gives us kind of permission to welcome ourselves. Like for at least for my journey, right? Like I've had to experience the warmth of others to better welcome myself. And I know that like sometimes people are like, oh, you should be able to do all the hard work on yourself, and like you should just be able to accept yourself. And it's like, well, that's not where I'm at, and I actually need a little bit of support, and I do need to be needy, and I do
Mhm.
need to get that welcoming from somebody, and the ability to receive it, to receive warmth, to receive somebody's invitation is just one of the most beautiful things in the world, and is something that is allowing me to welcome more of myself online as well.
Yeah, I mean, that validation goes a long way. And it can also be a little bit of a trap, right? Where we're constantly seeking outside validation. But I think when it's an intentional space, I mean, just going back to the idea of a container, right? Like if we're I think there's a real distinction between when we're unconsciously seeking something and when there's a conscious place where we can get that need met. And it's very intentional to show up there. And that's what it's there for, right? It goes in deeper and it actually fills the voids that we try to fill in these indirect ways often.
So we talked a lot about like some of the core childhood wounding that we might experience and how that kind of manifests itself, in moments of like trigger, and then moving into the conscious man. So like as we start to get towards our wrapping up, I wanted to talk a
Mm.
little bit about like some like practical things that people might be able to start doing today. Maybe it's their first time hearing about some of these things. Like, what are some of the things that you would recommend for Soma and then you, Tim, of like starting to get into this?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot. I think there's definitely like self work, right? We talked a lot about men's work and group work, and it's not a fix all, right? Being in men's work, we really have to show up for ourselves, and some men are not 100% ready for stepping into that kind of space, maybe trust or safety issues, whatever. But if you are feeling kind of stuck or just repeating patterns in your life or self-sabotaging, a lot can happen when you're willing to cultivate self-awareness, right? And it's one thing to you know retrospectively have awareness of like, oh yeah, I fucked up, like that sucks, and can't really turn back the clock. But one of the classic tools for cultivating self-awareness is learning to sit and meditate and just to be still and just to watch. And it's, if you're new to that practice, even that's kind of difficult without some guidance and some structure. But your ability to just like sit in your experience and like stay there. And I think there's different types of meditation, and there's forms that are a bit more embodied. And I think one of the things I'm just a huge advocate for is men learning how to really sink into their bodies more fully, and that really, you know, there's a lot to describing what embodiment is, but for me, it really begins with, can you really stay with the sensate experience without ejecting, right? Without going off into thought, without trying to distract yourself. Because that, I think, particularly in modern day, is just one of the vital skills that we all need to have. We live in this like ADHD world that is really cultivating more of that, right? How can we distract ourselves? How can we move away from? And I think we really, as men in particular, need to learn how to just be still, be connected, and be present with, and allow things to arise, and to stay with them, stay with the feeling, stay with the sensation, because that skill carries over into just about everything in life.
I couldn't agree with you more. I would say that embodiment and creating a conscious relationship with our own body is such an important step. And I think one of the reasons for me is because there's an assumption that I've heard. Of course, we all have a relationship with our body because I'm in my body all the time. And I've noticed that that isn't true. That there are people who, for lots of different reasons, don't allow themselves to sit in their own physical experience and feel what the thing is. And then when that feeling gets too big to ignore, I think that's often when we will run to um, things that will help to turn it down. And so just cultivating that, which brings me back to like, why is a chi generator or a yoga class or anything like that? This creation of a relationship, a conscious relationship with our own body, which then is a conscious relationship with our own feeling, uh, is a powerful tool so that we can make choices from that place. I feel like we're saying the same thing, and that stillness is one
Mhm.
way to do that because busying ourselves can sort of um, muddy the water there a little bit. But also for those who are still, there are these other kinds of practices that can welcome you into, well, what does challenge really feel like, and what happens in me when I meet the challenge? So I talk about this all the time, not just in embodiment circles, but in yoga classes. I'm like, we're not getting to our edge because it's the most impressive variation of what we're doing. We're getting to our edge so that we can then practice with all the things that come up. And you've probably heard this 100 times. I've said it many times. If something comes up on our yoga mat, it comes up in our life. So when I'm at my edge, if I start to want to run away, that's a thing I need to become aware of. If I start to get angry at the yoga teacher, which people do, that's a thing I should be aware of. And that's why I'll make a joke about it. But anyway, so piggybacking on what you said, I couldn't agree
Mhm.
more. I think that conscious relationship with our body is a tool of the conscious man for deeper and deeper authentic engagement.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm a huge believer in yoga. I've been practicing for over a couple decades, and um, one thing to be aware of, though, is particularly maybe as a man, or just how we tend to practice yoga as modern people, is it can kind of hook into a lot of the already prevalent masculine conditioning around performance, right? Where it's sort of more about like a competition of like doing versus being, right? And really connecting to our experience. So I think it's just important to realize where you're coming to it from, right? Are you doing it to like try to prove something, or are you really learning? It's the same practice no matter what you're up to, whether it's yoga or doing the dishes. Like, am I really able to be with this, right?
We had a conversation about this several episodes back where I was that person in a yoga class, like feeling the competitive edge. And I coined the phrase people doing the poses the mostest. Where like, you're in this class with these people that are super experienced and like if you're not aware of your own tendencies, you can get swept up into that very quickly like I did. And then I got injured because I was like, oh, I could do this. No, I could not.
I'll often remind people in class that sometimes the hardest or most advanced pose that they could do in that moment is not the fullest expression of the pose, but to honor where they're at. And like
Hmm.
one good example is like full wheel pose, right? Be like, and then reminding people, oh, your real practice might be recognizing that full wheel's not available to you today. And that it doesn't mean anything about you if the person next to you is in full wheel and you're in half wheel.
Absolutely.
But
Hmm.
that to me feels like the real yoga. When you're like, I'm
Yeah.
connecting with what is and working
Hmm.
with that, and it's not about the photo.
And really learning to ride your own ride. That's one of my favorite phrases that I've ever learned. Learned it in motorcycle training safety school. And it's like, it follows me everywhere, right? Like, the more that I can ride my own ride and feel confident to do that means that I've welcomed more of my own experience and trusting of my own self in, and I'm reliant less on the outside world. I'm reliant less on outside authority. So sometimes in a yoga class, I may need to ride my own ride. I may need to say, I cannot look at outside authority right now, and I need to do my own practice. While still respecting the space and the intention of that space. I think there's something to be said there.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the gift of like tapping into that warrior and just like pushing, and I think men sometimes do need to develop that part of themselves, particularly modern men, if they've gotten a little too soft, right, and a little too just like indulgent in you know comfort. So I think, I don't want to throw that out, but what I've noticed in myself as my practice has deepened, and because I have a very competitive side of me, and I'm strong physically, I'm capable, I can do a lot with my body, and it feels good on a certain level, but there is a way that we can disconnect and disembody even in like a powerful body based practice like that. And like you said, like there is something about, I think as we go deeper into healing our stuff and our patterns, there's just more of a subtlety to the path and the practice. And this is a little bit more advanced level than somebody just kind of stepping into this. But you get to notice those little nuances and learn how to, in somatic experiencing, they talk about something called like pendulation, right? So it's not just about always being at full throttle, right, and pushing our edge like that. It's like, can you lean into that edge, come back out of it, lean into it, and you kind of expand slowly over time. And I think that's how we cultivate both the kind of masculine and the feminine within us, right? There's like an interplay between those two that allows each one to develop in its own way. They kind of keep expanding out if there's awareness to both of them. And so it's like the masculine might be more that like push, let's go, let's do this, right? And the feminine is more like, hey, wait, hold on, is this safe? Like, can I go there? Can I open, right? So it's kind of dancing between those two. And I think as men, we need to develop both of those capacities so that we can, lead ourselves well into healing, into more depth, into more expansion, but also be able to bring that leadership to our relationships.
I love it. It's got me thinking of the visual of the clutch, right? Like the throttle or the clutch of like, with a car or my motorcycle, right? It's being able to like find that tension, right? Of like, when to accelerate, when to pull it back, and kind of just that dance that happens there. So love hearing
Yeah.
that.
What a great description of the human experience. It's interesting because when I think about the ocean and how sometimes it can sort of like gently ebb and flow, other times how it can be so powerful, and we never have like a fear of judgment. Where I sometimes feel men in their pursuit of understanding this balance that we're talking about, fear the perception of weakness, fear the perception of gayness or queerness at times. But if we could release that a little bit, then we would start to recognize, oh, it really is an ebb and flow, and I never call the tide weak, you know, or the current. Anyway, that was a well said. Thank you. Beautifully said.
Mm. Yeah.
Right. Any final thoughts? How are you feeling? Are you feeling complete?
I just want to say thank you so much for coming and having this conversation with us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait to have numerous more conversations with you. But hopefully, also share a physical space at some time. Come to a workshop, or been great having you.
Yeah, it's been I love where the conversation has gone. It's really been enjoyable, and yeah, look forward to further sharing.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. Tim, will you take us out, please?
I absolutely will. Let's close our eyes, allow ourselves to settle, and as we do, settle into appreciation and gratitude. Appreciation and gratitude for this sacred space, for this conversation, for any insights, awarenesses that came, any takeaways or nuggets of gold that we will hold on to. And in this moment now, we release the archetypes and the spirits. And with these words, our container is open but not broken. Aho.
Uh-huh.
Thank you so much for joining us here in the circle. If you'd like to stay connected to us between episodes, please follow us on Instagram at Queer Men's Embodiment. Like, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you find podcasts. And as we leave, now I wish you brotherhood, connection, authenticity, vulnerability, safety, and love. And with these words, our container is open but not broken. Aho.